Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest iteration of the web series The Survivor Becomes a Dungeon. If you're new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. As always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 162, Chris' Point of View. As they walked through the busy capital streets, Chris's ears swiveled beneath his hood. He thought he knew what busy looked like, but Sunspot Keep had nothing on this place, and the crowds that seemed to fill the sidewalks and streets around him. Checking in on his team, he watched Zax take up the rear of the group, and kept a keen eye on the team's pockets as they all walked. They were unknown to this place after all, and until they made contact with the local guild, they were likely fair game for any would-be fisherman. For her part, Sarah was already scanning the crowds, a mischievous smile creeping on her lips. Chris could practically see her eyes gleaming with avarice at the big city coin jingling around her. With the usual swish of his tail, he lightly smacked Sarah's hand before glancing at her from under his hood and shooting her a silent warning, before looking ahead again, while ignoring her vague disappointment. Just as they were targets for their fellow thieves and rogues until they properly presented themselves to the guild, they were also unable to engage in guild activities until they made their introductions to the local members, lest they step on toes or trespass on another's fishing grounds, amongst other things. As they continued to walk, the sound of rustling papers caught Chris's attention, away from the rest of the city's hustle and bustle. Following his ears, he watched Wren almost blindly walk in the middle of his team while reading through the papers that she'd received from the short mage. Hey, what do you have there? Wren jumped with surprise, and he got the impression that she hadn't realized how focused she was in her reading. She murmured as she looked up at Chris and flashed a sheepish smile while her tail swayed with evident delight and anticipation. It's magic stuff, she said simply before offering the papers to him while picking up the pace to walk at his side. Taking up the various sheets of paper, he casually flipped through the contents, his eyes scanning the writing for anything that made sense to him, which was frighteningly little. "I see. What's it about?" he asked, while handing the papers back to her. "Well, they're spells," she said as she flipped through the pages. "Cecil says that I need to figure out how to decipher his code and translate the instructions into something I can use. Then I can work on moving the mana around and out of my body to cast them. Though, with that said, I also need to get a spell focus if I want to be effective with actual casting with the small amount of mana that I have within my mana heart." Chris nodded along, doing his best to understand this magic talk. From what he knew, he would also need to figure out how to move mana around his body more effectively to use what he has in his mana heart for anything beyond basic enhanced vitality and the reduced need to eat and sleep. "So, what sort of spells are they?" he asked as he looked over the paper in her hands to try and understand what was written there, but with little success. He said they were known as shield and magic missile. Now, he also gave me instructions for a cantrip known as prestigitation, which is supposed to help me practice with all the intangible elements of magic. Wren said before scratching her cheek and looking up at Chris again. "Earth magic is especially tricky for novices who don't have an affinity with it," she commented before looking back to the papers. "Through practicing with prestigitation, I'll be able to figure out what elements I'm best suited to use, and then I should be able to develop more combat-based magic on what I learned from it in Magic Missile." Chris couldn't help but glance at his team while wondering if they were getting any of this. He was met with Sarah's thoroughly furrowed brows and Zax's glazed-over expression, as he seemed to have decided not to follow the conversation at all. Chris hummed for a moment as he considered what he understood. Isn't there an easier way to figure out what your strong suits are? Trial and error are all well and good, but wouldn't it be best to develop your strengths early on instead of dipping your finger into everything?" Chris watched Wren's ears droop beneath her hood before tilting her head from side to side while her tail came up to a stop. "I mean, yeah, it would be, but I don't want to trouble you with that," she said softly. Distinct disappointment was just dripping off from her voice. "Cecil says using magic as a tool that measures affinities is really expensive. Obsidian-ranked adventurers can have it done at a steep discount, and students at the Magic Academy can do it for free as part of their curriculum." Chris couldn't help but cringe at the mention of money, his hand twitching to reach for his coin pouch, but stopping himself so he didn't give away its hiding spot. "I see. Well, "Don't worry about it, okay?" he said while reaching out to pat Wren's upper back. "I'm sure that we'll, between whatever our boss Rito has in store for us and the business opportunities we come across here in the capital, we have plenty of coin coming in, more so than we got back home." "Sure," Wren offers hesitantly before smiling a little more. "But in the meantime, I'll do my best to work with what I have already." Chris pulled away, his mind wandering to other things she's mentioned she needed for casting magic. A spell focus. He didn't know enough about magic users to understand what was fully entailed, but he knew it was likely that special stick or staff that mages tended to carry around. With a soft exhale through his nose and a flick of his ears, he turned his focus back to the moment while reaching into his hood and pulled out an innocuous piece of paper he got from his home guild. The slip of paper had a basic map drawn with a couple of symbols, numbers, and abbreviations that were meant to be street names. Chris had reviewed the information on the paper this morning, but now that he was walking the streets, he wanted to make sure they were still heading the right way. "All way good?" Zax piped up, while peering over Chris's shoulder for a moment. "Yeah, we're on the right track. The entrance should be up ahead in the alleyway. We're supposed to say that we're in for an appointment and present the package we got." Chris explained quietly, double-checking the slip of paper before tucking it away again. With a grunt of understanding from Zax, the team proceeded forward until they came to an alleyway in question. Yet, when they arrived, there was no point of contact or anything for them to approach. It was like just a normal alleyway. "Are we getting punked, or did you read the map wrong?" Sarah asked with a growing agitation, her back pressed against the wall as she maintained watch, her head swiveling on each end of the alleyway, while the others poked around. Chris already had a slip of paper in hand, looking it over again as his eyes repeatedly darted from his surroundings back down to the paper. "It doesn't make any sense. The layout of this alleyway perfectly matches the map. According to this, I should be standing right on top of the entrance," he says while thumping his foot against the stone floor to emphasize his point, the stone in question sounding like the rest of the alleyway around them. "Maybe you're missing something," Wren offered thoughtfully as she approached Chris. "May I see the map?" "Yeah, go for it," Chris said before holding the slip of paper down to her and watching her brows furrow with thought. Wren appeared to thoroughly study the piece of paper in her hands as she looked between it and the surroundings before offering the paper back up to Chris and pointing at some numbers next to an abbreviation. "Have you figured out what these lead to? I recognize all the other letters as street names in the path we took to get here from the capital gates, but we haven't encountered whatever these numbers lead to." Chris couldn't help but blink a few times at the realization, and he looked over the slip of paper again. "You're right. I figured since we found the marked location already, we might have just skipped the unnecessary step." He's considered before looking back at the way they came. "Let's head back out onto the street." Now back among the crowd, Chris led his team down the street connected to the alleyway that they were just in, studying the buildings in question. He spotted the numbers on their windowsills and realized that the numbers on his map were the address of their destination. Continuing further down the road, he came across a cobbler set up beside the entryway of an alley that they had been at earlier. "This must be the place," Chris said aloud, more for himself than for his team, as he pushed the door open, holding it for Wren until Jack stepped closer and held it for Sarah. The trio dispersed and spread out amongst the shop while Wren grabbed a Chris's cloak and stayed by his side. At the counter, a bubbly and vibrant-looking young human woman with bright blonde hair piped up with a pleasant smile on her face. "Welcome to Marlborough's cobbler house. We handle everything from sandals to shoelaces. How may we help you today?" Of course, Chris was not expecting such a colourful figure to be manning what was essentially a guild entrance, but he did his best to take it in stride as he walked up to the counter with Wren in tow. "Hello. We have an appointment," he said probingly before reaching into his satchel and placing the still-sealed package on the counter. The young woman maintained a smile as she looked the package over, glancing around at Chris's team and Wren before pushing the package back towards Chris. "Of course, this way," she said while moving towards the back of the shop. After glancing at his team and nodding to each other, Chris collected the package and tucked it away again before following the young woman. They were quickly led through an actual cobbler's workshop, where an older-looking gnome was stabbing a thick needle into a piece of leather, seemingly ignorant of the strangers in his workshop. At the same time, they made their way to a door that should lead to an alleyway, by Chris's reckoning. However, instead of going through the door right away, The young woman grabs a crystal sconce on the wall, twisting the light fixture until it is upside down, before grabbing it like a lever and lifting it straight up. Both Chris and Wren's ears perked at once as they heard things shifting around at their feet. After mere seconds, the movement began, and everything suddenly went still. The young woman looked clearly amused as she gestured to the door. "Head straight down, take the left passageway and wait into the room from the third door on your right. The guildmaster would like to meet you all." Chris was about to thank the young woman for her guidance, but his words got caught in his throat, and he couldn't help but stare wide-eyed from under his hood. The guildmaster, as in the main boss, the one in charge of all of us. He had been under the impression that he would meet a branch manager, or maybe just a handler, who would be their general liaison to overall guild affairs and business. But the guildmaster? The woman maintained the ever-pleasant smile as her eyes narrowed like a predator gazing upon prey. "The one and only, at least for our country," she mused with a head tilt before gesturing to the door again. "The sooner you get going, the sooner I can notify them of your arrival." "Right, of course." Glancing at his team, Chris reached for the door in the alleyway and pulled it open, revealing an enclosed stone staircase leading down into a fairly well-lit corridor. Leading his team down the stairs, they came into a small lobby with a cozy-looking sitting area where a few rogues were casually conversing about this and that. They spared Chris and his team a glance, but immediately returned to their business. Making their way to the left corridor, they passed by a number of other corridors leading away to who knows where, until they finally came across the third door on the third right and stepped inside. They found a small, cozy-looking waiting room painted in shades of earthy browns and furnished with grey couches that lined the walls. Chris took a seat, patting with a tired huff as he pulled his hood back, freeing his ears as they wiggled and adjusted themselves now that they weren't restrained by the fabric. Wren took her place beside Chris, still looking around the little room with curious uncertainty after pulling her own hood back. For his part, Zach just flopped onto one of the couches, getting nice and comfortable despite the circumstances, while Sarah sat on the couch's armrest beside Chris and began almost immediately toying with one of his ears by poking it and making them flick around with a twitch. The team sat in relative silence for a few minutes until Wren decided to pipe up while looking at Chris.
So is it a big deal that you'll be meeting the guildmaster?"
Sarah just scoffed while suddenly leaning on over Chris's shoulders and the back of the couch, looking down into Wren's eyes with an amused look on her face.
"Is it a big deal? I'd say that it's an understatement of the decade. The guildmaster is the leader of the Thieves' Guild as a whole. Sure, smaller factions within the guild operate on their own terms, but the guildmaster has the final say on any major order."
Chris nodded slowly, leaning his back against Sarah's flat stomach, while looking at Wren.
"Well, I don't exactly know how it works in other countries. Our guildmaster holds a place in the Undercouncil, a collection of guildmasters who have hold over most organized crime in this country."
Wren could only nod along as she did her best to absorb all the information coming her way.
"Okay, they sound very important. What other guilds are part of this Undercouncil?"
Before they could respond, Zax released a soft snore, clearly showing how relaxed he was in the face of what was about to happen. Chris couldn't help but let out a sigh as an amused smile came across his face. After taking a moment to collect his thoughts, he regarded Wren again. "Well, there are quite a few guilds. There are the poisoners, the counterfeiters, the assassins, information brokers, and the smugglers," he explained while counting them out on his fingers, before raising a finger to his other hand. "And, of course, the thieves," he added as he let his hands fall back into his lap.
That's quite a lot. I didn't expect your line of work to have such a diverse workforce,"
Wren admitted as she glanced around the cozy waiting room. Sarah piped up at that as she began absently stroking Chris's hair.
"Yeah, and while we often cooperate between the various guilds when it comes to the jobs we perform, we keep everything separate and broken into even smaller factions within the guilds, to ensure that if any of us get caught, for whatever reason, we don't bring down the rest of the guilds with us." "Oh, so you run a decentralized system?"
Wren piped up enthusiastically. Chris and Sarah shared a glance, not having realized there was an actual word for how their guilds were set up.
Yeah, I suppose,"
Chris offered with a vaguely thoughtful look on his face as he scratched his cheek. Suddenly, Chris's ears perked at the door opening. He turned to follow his ears, spotting a particularly short, cloaked figure whose face was entirely shrouded by shadow despite the thorough illumination of the waiting room. "The guild master will see you now, if you will follow me."
"Right, let's get going then,"
Chris said as he waited for Sarah to get off of him before standing and getting Zax to his feet. They followed the cloaked little man to wherever the guildmaster was. End of chapter. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Sevaren Serberous, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Light Jock, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Lord Asrigal. Thank you very much.